Right, and last but by no means least is a great pleasure to welcome Sarah Hawkes, who is Professor of Global Public Health at UCL and bringing policy, global health, and in this case, gender together.
Indeed.
So, over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks to Larry and colleagues for inviting me to talk to you about gender. I'm impressed that you've all stayed till the end of the day. I used to be a sexual health researcher. It was a lot easier to get people to stay past 4 o'clock if you were going to promise a lecture about sex rather than about gender. And I'm going to start off by obviously explaining the difference between sex and gender. And I'm going to reflect as I talk on some of the issues that people have talked about during the day. So obviously you'll notice immediately that this is an advert for cigarettes. And we're going to come back to the role of the tobacco industry in influencing gender roles and gender norms. But I was actually just sitting thinking about what David was talking about. And I'm sure you all know that Keynes grew up for the early part of his life in Cambridge. So my daughter goes to an all-girls school in Cambridge, and one of the first visits that I did to the all-girls school in Cambridge, I was looking through their yearbooks in the library and sort of trying to understand something about the history of the school, and was very intrigued to find one John Maynard Keynes as a pupil in the all-girls school in Cambridge in his early years. And I was just wondering whether being in touch with his more feminine side led to less austere economic policies, and whether we should look at what Christine Lagarde's education background was. Right, so I'm going to move swiftly on to what we mean by gender. And the work that we do, I'm just going to go back actually, I should just say, talking about multidisciplinary approaches to public health. So I am a medical doctor with a PhD in epidemiology. Larry is the only person in the world, I think, ever to have taken my degree in sociology seriously. But I think that it informs a lot of my approach to public health. But I work very closely with a political economist of public health, or of health. So Kent and I work very closely because we are married and work together on combining the issue of how evidence feeds into public policy processes within global health institutions, and how global health institutions construct their own reality of what evidence looks like and what evidence should be responded to. So this piece of work that I'm going to present to you this afternoon is work that Kent and I did together, looking at how do public health institutions, global health institutions, respond to the evidence around gender. And we used as our starting point the very bog standard WHO definition of gender, which is that gender is a social construct. If you get more into the sociological and the theoretical literature, indeed gender is about the distribution of power between men and women. But the main point to remember, as has been beautifully described by Simone de Beauvoir, amongst others, is that you are not born a woman, you become a woman. The caveat to this slide, I would say, is in the looking at the sex ratio at birth data, where the chances of being born a girl are entirely dependent on the patriarchal level of the society in which your mother is pregnant. So we see far more sex-selective abortions in highly patriarchal societies in North India, for example, than we see in South India. So I fully agree. I wouldn't dare disagree with Simone de Beauvoir, but right now, here at the beginning of the 21st century, gender norms influence the chance even of being born in large parts of the world. More theoretical gender theorists like to talk about gender as not being fixed. Gender is something that we perform in our everyday lives. Gender isn't static, gender is relational. So if you look at the work of a theorist like Judith Butler, she talks about gender identities and gender expression, and how we express our gender is entirely dependent on the situation we find ourselves in and who we're talking to. And the importance of going through all of this, really, apart from to bring in some great examples of the performance of gender, is to remind you that gender is not really a binary measure. We do, in public health, completely conflate gender and sex in most of our surveys. And the survey data that I'm going to present to you does that conflation. But if you're truly measuring gender, it's not something that is male, female, yes, no. It's much more complex than that simple question would beg to suggest. So what Kent and I looked at was, what's the evidence for any kind of relationship between gender and health? And we published it in the Lancet. And what's been interesting is the slowness of a response. Unlike the sort of immediate responses that you've heard about all afternoon with people writing angry letters, what was interesting to me, having spent 20 years as a sexual health researcher working particularly with feminist activist communities in South Asia, was the total silence with which this paper was met. And it's only now starting to have an effect in terms of people asking questions about what the data in the paper might mean and what our findings in the paper might mean. So I guess Luke's would analyse this as the power just to keep silent about truths can be equally as powerful as the power to argue about evidence. We did really simple epidemiology. I do have a PhD in epidemiology, but I haven't used data in a very long time. And so we simply used global burden of disease data, took the top 10 conditions, the top 10 risk factors, and looked at male-female differences. And being such a simple epidemiologist, I've very carefully colour-coded these as blue for boys and pink for girls, so that you can follow that schematic all the way through the slides. And we chose the top 10 conditions purely to make a point. If we'd chosen the top 20 conditions, we would find exactly the same thing. And the point that we were trying to make was that these are the kinds of data sets that big global health institutions, the powerful decision makers within those institutions, should be paying attention to when they set agendas and when they decide on resource allocation, for example. They are supposed to use these data sets. That's why Chris Murray and his group bend over backwards to collect the data. And even, David, for BSc students, we don't even have to present this to master's students. To BSc students, we're able to say, tell me something about this, and they're all able to say, well, the blue bars are higher in all 10 cases. So the global burden of disease for the top 10 conditions is higher in men globally than it is in women. As you all know, I'll go back to this one. What we highlighted was that for road injury in particular, the difference, just the ratio, is around 3-to-1, and we'll come back to that in a little while. As you all know, since you know everything about the public health and the drivers of health outcomes and the drivers of the drivers, the global burden of disease also looks at risk factors and gives a DALY weight to risk factors, which are behavioural risk factors, environmental risk factors, and metabolic risk factors. And again, if you look at the risk factors, the top 10 risk factors, which are a mix predominantly of behavioural and metabolic risk factors with a little bit of environmental risk factor in there with air pollution. It's all more burdensome in men, all of it. And again, we see two conditions in particular, tobacco and alcohol, where the DALY burden is 3 times higher in men compared to women. A bit confusingly, when Chris Murray produces his graphs, he swaps the colours round. So if you can shift your minds for a moment, in this graph, the blue represents women and the pink represents men. And what he's essentially looked at is the gains in mortality reduction globally over the period when they first started doing the global burden of disease, 1990, up to the most recent. Because one of the big headline pieces of news from the global burden of disease in 2010 was essentially that mortality rates were coming down, in that people were dying at older ages, partly driven by the huge gains in life expectancy, or reductions in mortality rates in the very young age groups, as has been talked about already today. But if you analyse this graph very clearly, and the paper that we've taken the graph from refers to it specifically, the greatest gains in mortality reduction were clearly made by women globally. And the least gains in mortality reduction were made by men in the younger age groups. So men in the 30 to 34, 25 to 29, 35 to 39. That group of men have gained least from the world's improvements in life expectancy. So we summarize this, it's not rocket science, by saying men have higher risks, men get sicker, men die younger. That's clearly what this global burden of disease data set that all these institutions are supposed to be paying attention to tells us. The story is nothing new, really. But the big question then is, well, why is the difference? Is that difference biological or behavioural? So we did go back to the biological data, and I'm sure anybody, I noticed somebody here had a badge saying Department of Chemistry, which I was so impressed in terms of multidisciplinary approaches to public health. It's fantastic to have such a range of people represented. So at least one person in the room will recognise this is a molecule of testosterone. And so the big question in terms of nature and nurture is, are those risks, those behavioural patterns, that excess mortality, that mortality at a younger age, is that all just driven by testosterone? And the answer, as far as I and others could tell, is that there's no clear evidence that all of this is down to biology. There are almost as many theories at a biological level as to what drives male weakness, biological weakness, as there are researchers working on it. And everything else I'm about to tell you is not at all to deny that there is a biological element to the data that I've shown you. But what I want to focus on is how much of the difference is actually down to behaviour, that is gendered behaviour, rather than the biology of sexual difference. Again, going back to that data set, this data set, the global burden of disease data, shows us something that we've known about in this country since churches first started to collect mortality records, death records, which is that baby boys die at a higher rate than baby girls. Your chances of survival in that 0 to 1 and 0 to 5 age group as a boy globally are lower than they are if you're a baby girl. If you look at miscarriages, if you look at the large proportion of pregnancies that end in a miscarriage, you have a far higher, in some studies it's 2.5 times higher rate of miscarriage if it's a biological male fetus rather than a female fetus. So it does seem as if at the moment of conception, right through to birth, right through to early childhood, boys have an inherent biological disadvantage. Although anybody who's worked in global health programs would tell you that that's not at all the discourse that we see in maternal and child health programs, which are all about protection of the girl child. What we start to see by adolescence is that behavior starts kicking in as far as the DALY burden is concerned. This is where we start to see boys start driving really badly, but boys start driving. So I think one of the things to point out with the road injury statistics is it's the problem. It's not that all men are bad drivers, much as I would love to be able to make that joke towards you. It's actually about rates of exposure. So in most societies in the world, women simply don't drive at nearly the same rate that men drive at. You don't have women in high-risk road occupations. They're not the taxi drivers, they're not the coach drivers, the truck drivers, the moto rickshaw drivers. So this is about exposure and perhaps something about the way young boys drive. One particular piece of data that to me, coming from the world of sexual health, was particularly intriguing is this big gap in interpersonal violence, DALYs. Because almost the entire discourse of gender-based violence is about protection of women. Gender-based violence in the WHO definition of GBV is about violence against women. But when you unpack I'm just going to come back to that. When you unpack the DALY data across all age groups around violence, this is interpersonal violence. This isn't wars. This is what people do to each other. Across all of the groups of, all of the categories of violence, the burden is much higher in men compared to women. It's not at all to deny the problem of men beating up women, but it is pointing out that when men are violent to each other, they tend to use implements and instruments that cause a lot more damage. Just coming back to this slide, what we do note, which won't again be a surprise to most people, is that what we see in females is we start to see anxiety, depression, and some nutritional problems coming in at a far higher rate than in adolescent boys. From a gendered perspective, I just want to flag up this idea that adolescent girls and women throughout their lives have higher rates of anxiety and depression. In many, many societies, it's extremely difficult for men to admit to being anxious and depressed. What men do admit to instead is using drugs and alcohol, perhaps to overcome their anxiety and depression. But it's culturally very difficult in a lot of places for men to admit that kind of gender norm weakness of being anxious and depressed. So I think the mental health data from a gender perspective in the global burden of disease needs to be analysed, needs to be viewed very, very carefully. Okay, so here comes the bit where it's, well, the drivers of the driver. I've tried to persuade you that some of the differences that we see in the DALY risk-taking data and in the DALY outcome data, those big differences between men and women are measured at the level of individual behaviours, but they themselves are driven by something more structural. And what I think this is where the dovetailing of all of our interests comes in. What we have been looking at a lot, both within the paper that we published and subsequently, is the role of the commercial sector in driving home what gender norms are in different societies. So I'm just going to present you a few pictures to show you the kinds of images that you're all familiar with on a day-to-day level, to really reinforce what it means to view these behaviours from a gendered perspective and see how much these behaviours are driven by the role of social norms through advertising and through commercial product placements. So the one area where I would say that I slightly disagree with Martin, who had the picture up of Ronald Reagan, I think, saying that no actor or actress would get involved in that kind of advertising now. But of course, what we see instead is product placement within films. So they can't advertise because they're not allowed to, but we have lots of examples of actors and actresses or One Direction singers, as I can tell you as the mother of an adolescent girl, who are role models and smoking. Alcohol's another one that where the role of the commercial sector in pushing a norm of masculinity, that's a masculinity about incredibly masculine sports, or even the ones that are perhaps more geeky, nerdy sports, like sitting at home with your Game Boy or whatever that thing is. There is an entire culture around what it means to be a man in many societies, is you are someone who can hold their drink. And when we look at, I mean, some of you will know the extraordinary amount of money that goes from alcohol companies into the sports sector in this country. And over 95% of that money goes into men's sports. And it portrays this, it perpetuates this image that being a man is associated with being able to drink. I don't really need to explain this one. I think anybody who's ever watched Top Gear, anybody who's ever made a joke about a man and his car, will know everything about the way we associate certain aspects of masculinity with cars. And then we're really surprised when we give licenses to 17-year-old boys and they go out on the road and behave appallingly. And then I took this one at the weekend in Waitrose at Trumpington. Not at the checkout, because they're not allowed to have the sweets at the checkout, are they? But I turned round from the checkout, and there was a really great example of how the commercial sector, even on something like chocolate, traditionally such a feminine product, the sort of thing when, you know, you're feeling it's that time of the month or you're a little bit down about life, boost yourself with chocolate. But now there's an entire man-sized chocolate available, which essentially, as far as I can work out after a little bit of digging around on the net, just means you eat more chocolate. And when we look at the data about obesity levels around the world, we find in many parts of the world, it shifts by region, or it's divided by region, but in many regions of the world, obesity levels are much higher in men than they are in women. So the hypothesis that we've been working on is that a lot, and it completely dovetails, I know, with everything else that you've heard this afternoon, is that a large part of these gendered differences in behaviours and outcomes are driven by profit, essentially. It's not to say that these companies are making gender norms happen, but they are perpetuating the stereotypes. They are pushing them. These companies, however, as we all know, are extraordinarily clever. And what these companies have cottoned onto much, much, much faster than the global health community is cottoned onto is that gender is not static. Gender norms change. And what might have been appropriate to push to an audience of men with money in their pockets 30 years ago is no longer the kind of tired old stereotype that works in 2016 for empowered young women. So the gender roles modernisation hypothesis has been around essentially since the late 70s. And what it really says, it's the work of a feminist researcher. And what she essentially says is that as societies, we create idealised norms. And in most societies, those idealised norms are men. We create a norm that everybody wants to attain, that is a masculine norm. We all want the freedom that comes with being a man in most societies. So when we create opportunities for girls through education, through empowerment, through unregulated societies that allow education and empowerment to happen in a vacuum of lack of regulation, those girls, funnily enough, start to behave just like boys, because that's what they've spent their lives wanting to be. Her concern, the researcher's concern from the 1970s, is played out. I mean, if you look at newspaper coverage, literature from around the world, it's all about the changing norm of what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a woman. It's nothing new in any of this. If you look back to the early history of cigarettes, Anna will be able to tell you much more about it than I can, but they were marketed as torches of freedom. When I talk about gender and smoking and alcohol in the schools around Cambridge, even though I work at UCL, as you've gathered by now, live in Cambridge and occasionally go around and talk about what it means to be a girl in 2016, the answer that comes back from young adolescent girls and women, why do you smoke? Because it's cool. Because I'm essentially saying, up yours to society. Because this is my freedom to do so. So this mythology of freedom associated with being able to smoke it started in the 1920s and is still carrying on. The tobacco companies have definitely recognised this. This is a quote from the Tobacco Reporter. As Anna, I know, has written about the market, the untapped market in Asia and Africa still is young women. And of course, it's not just tobacco, it's alcohol as well. So that, given that we've got big companies who've recognised that gender norms are changing, that not only do young women are they more educated, they're more empowered, they have more money in their pockets, it leads to changes in behaviour at a national level as measured through these surveys that take place across Europe every 4 years amongst 15 and 16-year-olds. I think they ask 100,000 teenagers across 38 European, perhaps 28 European countries about essentially about everything teenagers are interested in, sex, drugs and rock and roll. So they ask them about their smoking rates and the alcohol rates. And the alcohol, I must say, when I first read the alcohol questions, I was slightly horrified because there is a physiological difference in how much alcohol it takes to get drunk if you're a teenage girl compared to a teenage boy. They don't ask about units consumed. They ask the question, in the past 30 days, have you drunk alcohol to such an extent that you vomited, fell over, or became unconscious? And when you know that that's the question, and now look at the graphs that essentially 45% of European teenagers have drunk themselves stupid. Sorry?
In the last 30 days.
Yeah, 45% have drunk themselves stupid in the last 30 days. But what I would like you to focus on is the diminishment in the gap between boys and girls across Europe, and that by the time we got to about 2009, just after the Spice Girls and their girl power had really taken effect across the continent, we then, at that point, had more girls than boys smoking. For those of you that work in the UK, you'll know that that's a pattern that was repeated across the UK between men and women, that as women moved into the workforce in the 1940s, this is a very well-told story, as women got empowered, they started to behave just like men and they started to smoke just like men. When I was looking at this slide, I actually went back and found when Engels wrote The Condition of the Working Classes in 1840. Thank you. Even he noted that when the women went into the factories, that they started smoking just like the men did. So there's nothing new in any of this. It's just we've got better data to show you what happens. What I found interesting about the UK data is it seems to me to suggest that there's more resistance amongst women to reducing smoking rates compared to men. So if you look at what happened with public health campaigns to get people to stop smoking, men stopped smoking at a faster rate from a higher starting point than women did. And today, what we're seeing in the wards, I'm sure in Addenbrooke's as elsewhere, is still increasing rates of female lung cancer, but diminishing rates of male lung cancer, reflecting those trends from 20, 30 years ago. I just want to present this. I think this is my last bit of data, just to sort of strengthen this idea that empowerment, in the absence of any kind of regulation of what the market is up to, can lead to unexpected problems as far as public health is concerned. This is a graph from the Bulletin WHO. It's two researchers, Hitchman and Fong, and they have simply, at an aggregate national level, presented the gender empowerment measure, gender empowerment ratio, which is a UNDP measure of female participation in the workforce, female participation in politics, female participation in education, and you come up with a measure for each country. And then the y-axis is smoking prevalence ratios. So it's the ratio of female to male smoking. So if you're in a country like Bangladesh, which is very low on the gender empowerment measure, you have hardly any women who smoke. But by the time you get to gender empowered Sweden, you've actually got more women smoking than men. So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to now explore the question of, well, what are we doing with all this data? What are we as the global health community doing with all this data? And I know it will be very unexpected to some people in the room, but I'm about to praise the World Bank, that they are, amongst the institutes that we looked at, they're one of the few institutions that understood gender in its true sense. And their health programs are, in theory, gender responsive rather than focused on the health of women. WHO, in theory, understands gender as well. In practice, it has a department of gender and women's health. When we look at the big funders of global health programs, their construction, their concept of what gender means, so they look at all of the same data that we've just looked at this afternoon, and they decide that the core activity for their work is on women. Heaven forbid that it should be about women for women's sake. It's women because women have to shoulder the burden of the health of their entire family and their community, if you are the US Global Health Initiative. But my particular favourite not, is DFID, who focus their gender and health work on women to ensure that healthy mothers can raise strong children. And they want to bring private sector expertise into DFID's strategy on gender equality. So the big funding agencies, they look at all of that data and they go, oh, well, it's clear, we better focus on women because they're going to bring up babies. We've recently been looking at the big global public-private partnerships, of which there are 19 that we've surveyed. So these are the sort of major players in terms of, well, predominantly in terms of infectious disease control. These public-private partnerships currently get around 17% of the development assistance for health outlay every year. So they get around $5.56 billion per year between these 19 institutes. And if you look at their position on gender, essentially it's equally as bad. There is not a single institution that has a gender policy. 2 out of 3 of all board members across the 19 institutes are men. And when we looked in detail at the health policies of the health strategies of all 19 institutions, every single one of them that mentioned gender focused it on women's empowerment, poor women and children, women as mothers. Okay, I'm going to just very, very quickly say, why does this matter? It matters because when it actually comes to delivery of services on the ground, we are not seeing equity in terms of gender as a social determinant of health. So I've taken the HIV data from South Africa here to point out that when we have a very narrow construction and conception of what gender is, that gender means being a woman, being a poor woman who's going to have children, we focus our programs, we deliver health services that are about health for women and babies. We tend to miss out the other 50% of the population that also needs services. So if you look at ARV uptake, antiretroviral uptake by HIV positive men in South Africa, that figure is repeated across the entire sub-Saharan African continent. There is a gap of anywhere between 12 and 19% in men's access to antiretrovirals. So then when we look at survival rates, men don't come into services. When they do appear, they appear late. Treatment doesn't work. They die more quickly. So the conclusions that we came to are that actually, as I've said, there's nothing new in these data sets. The people collecting the burden of disease data since the early 1990s, so since the 1980s, very clearly showed that even in the 1980s, the burden of disease was much higher in men than it was in women. There is some evidence from some regions that women's behaviour is changing. We think that is driven not just by women becoming empowered and educated, but by commercial factors that then drive those empowered, educated, financially more flush women to spend their money on commercial products that are not beneficial to their health, like smoking and alcohol. The response of public health communities has been, quite frankly, appalling to these data sets that have been around for at least 25, 30 years. We suffer from unbelievable levels of institutional path dependency, and I'm going to, as a feminist researcher, say we suffer from unbelievable levels of patronizing norm promotion from within public health institutions that equate gender to mean the health of mothers. They're not worried about people my age or people between the ages of 5 and 9, because we're not reproducing. We might be women or girls, we're not reproducing. We don't figure in any of their plans and strategies. They simply equate gender to mean women of reproductive age. if we're going to change any of that, we need to start by understanding what gender means rather than what women's health means. Thank you.
Thanks, absolutely fascinating. So, questions from the floor? It seems to me that what you're advocating is a person-based approach. I mean, it's more about people and not about stereotypes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're advocating has been, alma ata, health for all. Yeah. We're saying that the global health community has had a very poor history of picking and choosing who is deserving of attention. So somebody like Michael Reich in the 1990s looked at the attempts by the World Bank to reposition some resource allocation towards adult health in the face of most resources going to children's health, and found that the way global health is framed, it's all about poor, vulnerable babies and mummies. And it's really difficult to break that framing. So even the World Bank couldn't break the framing of all that money needs to go to poor babies.
Is that, sorry, just to follow up on that, I mean, it links back to much earlier in the day when we were talking about vertical and horizontal, that it's really another manifestation of the way that we tend to think, which is the grouping, whether it be a disease, a vertical program for HIV or malaria, and in this case it's a population group, and that the horizontal thinking has largely, it's been very difficult to promote during the rise of more neoliberal, whatever, the philanthropic kind of approaches, and WHO has moved away from horizontal to vertical, or allowing vertical stuff, and that there's a need to get back to something which is about whole populations.
Yes, very much so.
Comes into that
yes,
as well.
very, very, very much so.
So, any questions from Larry?
Thanks, Sarah. I thought that was fascinating. Just not really a question, just a couple of just interesting historical comments. One is, of course, blue and pink used to be reversed, right? So in the early 1900s, it was the Virgin Mary blue, girls wore blue, and upper class boys wore pink. So, and around 1950s, there was a consolidated effort to switch that in mass marketing and the rise of chain stores, et cetera. So that was like a deliberate commercial, so the power of corporations. And the other thing is the birth of modern advertising was spearheaded by Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and who popularized Freud in the US, and literally invented modern advertising. He had worked in the Department of Propaganda, and he thought there was a negative connotation, so he changed it to public relations. And the very first campaign was the 1924 Thanksgiving Day parade, when it was a deliberate policy to how to market cigarettes to women. And at the Thanksgiving Day parade, he had 20 debutantes at a timed event with photographers pull out cigarettes from their garter belts and light up.
Yeah.
And that's the same strategy they're still using today globally. So just, thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was fascinating. Mine is more of a comment as well, just to support your case and follow up from what Larry was saying. And we see country after country that what the tobacco industry does, and it follows exactly from the model of Bernays in the US, is when they get into new markets, in almost, I think, every market that I've seen, men smoke more than women, and they're saying it's all about profits. The women aren't smoking, we need to get them to smoke. And when you look through the industry documents, it's not only about the marketing, well, this is also marketing, it's developing products that women will smoke, and the whole new Virginia Slims and the Slim cigarettes and the pink packaging, and it's rolled out country after country. Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Depressing.
Just a comment aside, I don't know whether you agree, but the turning point in the UK probably was, or maybe internationally, but certainly observable in the UK, was Madonna, because smoking was not seen in the media and films. There was a period when it was much less apparent than now. I don't know whether you've done that.
No.
And then Madonna started, it was a kind of rebellion against the normative behaviour of not smoking.
Right.
So that's
Fascinating.
A bit of
Yeah,
an
yeah, yeah,
advantage
yes,
into your-
Fits in.
Yeah, great.
And as a mother of teenage daughters, I think that the resistance to giving up smoking by women is because of it helps with weight
Yeah.
management. So
Yeah.
that's not just teenagers, but everyone.
Yeah, which fits in with gender
More
norms
stereotypes.
as well. Yes.
One question up here, and then probably that's the last question, and then we'll have a brief panel.
It's more of a comment as well. If you look at sexual orientation and smoking rates, you'll find far higher rates of smoking in teenage lesbians and young gay men. And I don't think anybody's really addressing that side of it at all at the moment.
Well, I think when Anna was speaking, you talked about tobacco industry funding NGOs, and I don't know if you saw that paper that Kelly Lee published a few months ago about the tobacco industry, Philip Morris funding ACT UP very clearly through the 80s and early 90s, exactly for, as you pointed out, with gender-based violence, for attention diversion. So ACT UP was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. So that was essentially mainly a gay men's movement in the US at the start of the AIDS epidemic. It became extremely powerful movement, really argued for access to antiretrovirals and reductions in prices. So it had an enormous impact on global public health. And it turned out that they were being funded by Philip Morris.
Right, well, thank you again.